Slowly, Kurita's fleet regrouped, heading north, while the exhausted, foggy-brained Kurita deliberated his next move. At about 10 a.m., Yamato sailed into a sea-slick strewn, Admiral Ugaki wrote, with American sailors. They were probably survivors of the Gambier Bay, sunk just an hour earlier. The sea was stained dark red from the dye in the Japanese shells that had struck the American ship. What did they think of the magnificent sight of our fleet in pursuit? Wondered Ugaki. Admiral Koyanagi's thoughts, as he later recorded them, were typically more benign. He no longer felt enmity toward the stranded sailors. He hoped and assumed that they would be rescued before too long. Suddenly, a 25mm machine gun opened up on the sailors in the water. From his permanent post on the bridge, Admiral Kurita immediately gave the order to stop shooting. Lookout Koitabashi was not surprised. It was just not in Kurita's nature, he thought to himself, to shoot drowning dogs. Koitabashi was taken aback when some of the Americans in the water waved at the passing Japanese ship. It was very strange to me, he recalled. We were the enemy. I thought Americans must be people who value life. We would have drowned ourselves or tried to swim away. At 11:20 a.m., Kurita ordered the fleet to turn and head southwest, toward Leyte Gulf. None of Kurita's staff was eager to continue on the mission. All regarded it as suicide. Enlisted men like Koitabashi and true believers like Ugaki might have imbibed the cultural cliché that all Japanese warriors longed to die, but the officers on Kurita's staff were not so ready to embrace death, not as pointless sacrifice. Kurita's men knew from intercepted radio messages that American planes were operating out of Tacloban, the airfield just a few minutes flying time from the Gulf. They were sure that Halsey's carrier groups had surrounded them, and that they would be trapped. In an interview after the war, Koyanagi compared Leyte Gulf to a pond and the Kurita fleet to a bag of mice. Our heads were cooling, Koyanagi recalled. A more accurate description might be that their emotions were crashing. They had slept little, if at all, for 3 days. The euphoria of seeing American carriers on the horizon at dawn had worn off, and after a chaotic 2-hour running battle, Kurita's men were coming down, hard. The duration of most gun battles at sea during the Second World War was short, often less than a half-hour in the sharp night clashes off of Guadalcanal. Kurita's fleet had been torpedoed, bombed and shot at repeatedly over 3 days. It would be surprising if its officers and men were not in a physical and mental condition approaching shock. What happened next would be the source of enduring controversy and mystery. Sometime before noon, according to Kurita's battle report, the Yamato received a signal. An enemy task force had been spotted bearing 5 degrees distance 113 miles from Suluan Light at 9:45 a.m. In plainer language, at 9:45 a.m., one of Halsey's carrier groups had been spotted off the coast of Samar, presumably following in the wake of Kurita's fleet, ready to spring a trap. The wireless telegram was read aloud on the bridge, recalled Commander Atsuo Ito, the commander of the battleship's float plane squadron. Ito recalled that Admiral Kurita asked how far away the enemy's position was from his own fleet's current position. The answer came back, about 60 miles to the north. In a voice hardly above a whisper, a fellow officer on the bridge suggested to Commander Ito, "We should go after the main force." By main force, he meant Halsey's carriers. He was guessing that they had tangled with a group of Halsey's carriers to the south, but that the main force was trailing along over the horizon to the north. This junior officer's sentiment, whispered at first, was universally shared among Kurita's staff officers. There was no inclination to complete the mission by attacking the American landing force inside Leyte Gulf. True, those were their orders. But their orders also permitted the Kurita force to attack any American carrier task force encountered along the way. The information in the telegram suggested that not too far to the north was just such a target. If they were to die, Kurita's staffers reasoned, better to have a chance to sink a few carriers in a shootout in the open sea than to get trapped in the narrow confines of Leyte Gulf. Kurita's men, just like Halsey's men, were fixated on destroying enemy carriers. In a post-war interview, Kurita's chief of staff Koyanagi echoed Halsey's chief of staff Kani. "Carriers," he said, "were our obsession." Just as they had for the past 3 days, Kurita's men were feeling abandoned and alone. There had been no communications from headquarters in Tokyo that morning, and no word from Admiral Ozawa's decoy carrier force to the north. Kurita's men assumed that Ozawa's mission had failed or that he had been destroyed. They knew from messages trickling in from Admiral Shima that Admiral Nishimura's southern force had been all but wiped out as it tried to force the Surigao Strait. As Kurita's staff huddled to discuss what to do at noon on October 25th, the Americans struck again. About 70 planes of various taffy carriers, coming in waves, bore in strafing and bombing Kurita's fleet. Kurita's lieutenants were sure that more and worse punishment awaited them inside Leyte Gulf. At 12:36 p.m., Admiral Kurita issued new orders. The fleet would turn around and head north. It would crash into the American carrier task force. Far better to die making a noble sacrifice against the main enemy force, Kurita and his staff had unanimously agreed, than to die pointlessly shooting at empty transport ships. At his lookout post on the wing of the bridge, Petty Officer Koitabashi at first wondered why the great ship was swinging around to the north, but then he heard over the PA the Yamato captain describe the fleet's new, more glorious mission. He joined his mates in shouting banzai. The change of course, presented in such a way, sounded like a bold stroke, an uncharacteristic improvisation, jettisoning one set of orders to seek a better opportunity. But the circumstances were suspect. There was no American task force bearing 5 degrees distance 113 miles from Suluan Light at 0945, or anywhere close. Halsey's ships were still another 300 miles away. Even if the sighting had been real, there was no guarantee that Kurita would be able to find a force spotted 2 hours earlier, 60 nautical miles distant, some 3 hours steaming time away. After that morning's nasty surprise encounter between Japanese battleships and American carriers, it was unlikely that the Americans would allow their carriers to once again come within gun range of Kurita's fleet. No mention of that 9:45 a.m. wireless telegram has ever been found in any official message file. Possibly it was lost. Possibly a lone Japanese scout plane saw the Taffies retreating at 9:45, or saw the shadow of clouds on the water, and sent in a report that was relayed to the Yamato. The Imperial Japanese Navy's official history, Kokan Senshi, surmises that a scout plane saw the tail end of Kurita's own fleet, mistaking it for the Americans. Or more likely, as some Japanese naval scholars and IJN veterans have long suspected, the telegram never existed. According to this more plausible theory, Kurita's staff needed a face-saving excuse to escape certain death and destruction in Leyte Gulf, so they concocted a bogus telegram offering up a new, more worthy enemy to attack. No one can know for certain. No member of Kurita's staff ever confessed to the fiction. Suspicions have long centered on Captain Otani, the chief operations officer, who was evasive on the subject after the war. The Yamato's chief paymaster, Tsuneo Ishida, recalled seeing Otani coming down from the anti-aircraft observation deck to the main bridge and leaning in to speak quietly to Admiral Kurita as the Americans renewed their bombardment after noon. "Kurita-san," Otani allegedly said, "maybe it's time to go home." Not everyone on the bridge of the Yamato welcomed Kurita's turnabout. Over in his corner, Admiral Ugaki was seething. "Why?" he angrily demanded. He did not address this inquiry to Kurita. That would have been insubordinate. Rather, he looked at Kurita's chief of staff, Admiral Koyanagi. "Why are we turning?" Ugaki exclaimed. "The enemy is that way." He gestured to the south with his thumb. Koyanagi tried to placate Ugaki, but it was useless. Ugaki was in a high state of agitation. He believed that he was, at last, engaged in true decisive battle. He credulously recorded in his diary the thoroughly incredible claim of the 10th Destroyer Squadron to have accomplished the great feat of sinking 3 carriers, 1 cruiser, and 1 destroyer. If true, such a toll would have surpassed the achievements of any Japanese fleet in a single battle in 3 years of war. Ugaki had not yet begun to fight. He had fired only 81 of Yamato's 1,080 giant 18-inch shells, but because of Kurita's retreat, he believed, he might never again have the chance to fire his big guns at an enemy ship. Once more, Ugaki was being robbed of the chance to die honorably. In his diary that night, Ugaki avoided criticizing Kurita by name, as was his custom, but spluttered that they wavered again and cancelled the charge into Leyte Gulf. I felt irritated to be on the same bridge, seeing that they lacked fighting spirit and promptitude. As the Yamato swung her water-heavy bow to the north, other officers permitted themselves, for the first time in days, to believe that they might live. Commander Ito, the floatplane squadron commander, had not bothered to wear a helmet. What was the point, since he was sure of dying? But now, Ito put a helmet on his head. The next day, as the fleet ran westward to safety, he would put on an armoured flak jacket. At the spot where the Johnston went down, the Pacific Ocean is 5 miles deep. The waters are warm, about 84 degrees in late October, but cold enough after dark to give a man hypothermia over many hours of floating. By day, the sun is powerful enough to sear and permanently scar the skin. Stinging jellyfish and sharks abound. On an empty sea at noon on October 25th, the 270-odd surviving officers and men of the Johnston clung to floater nets, a few life rafts and bits of wreckage. On the rising swell, they could see the mountain tops of Samar, 60 miles away. The men organized themselves. The wounded were placed on the rafts and inside the nets, webs of nylon rope attached to buoys. A symphony of moans had started up, recalled Lieutenant Hagen. A pharmacist's mate asked Hagen, "Who gets the morphine?" Hagen replied, "The ones who cry the loudest." Missing a leg, Lieutenant Bechdel was so doped up on painkillers that he began to sing. Blessed with a mellifluous voice, he sang as if he and his buddies were gathered around a campfire. Shortly after noon, an Avenger torpedo plane flew low overhead and dipped its wings. "It won't be long now," thought Clint Carter, the Texan gunner's mate who had screamed so hotly for more ammo during the battle. The men of the Johnston were adrift no more than a couple of 100 miles from the greatest naval armada ever assembled on Earth, thought Carter. Help was surely on the way. The officers and petty officers began handing out rations, malted milk balls and Camel cigarettes. There was no way to light the cigarettes, so Chief Boatswain's mate Burnett used his as chewing tobacco. He did not realize how thirsty he might get. The drinking water in the casks attached to the raft was putrid. Someone had forgotten to change it. As the sun began to sink in the west, the first doubts began to rise. A large stingray, the size of a dining room table, recalled Joe Check, kept swimming between the rafts, not really dangerous but eerie. At 3 p.m. came the sight they all dreaded, a shark fin. The men splashed and kicked, and the shark veered away. It would return, the men knew, and not alone. The Avenger pilot who saw the Johnston survivors was under radio silence. As soon as he landed, he reported their location, but he misremembered the coordinates. 2 destroyer escorts were dispatched, but they found no one, and broke off the search at 11:30 p.m. About 20 mules to the south, the survivors vainly scanned the empty horizon. 5 more times the Americans bombed Kurita's fleet as it staggered north that afternoon at under 20 knots. Every ship was leaking oil from hits or near misses that popped rivets and broke seams. Finally, when the last American plane had dropped the last bomb, and the shadows were lengthening on the worst day in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a few Japanese airplanes, dive bombers and Zeros, appeared in the afternoon sky. In a final indignity, 2 of the Zeros flew down and strafed their own ships, mistaking them for American. From time to time during that long afternoon as the fleet steamed north, then west around the island of Samar, Admiral Ugaki would urge that the fleet charge to the northeast. Some of the American airstrikes had come from the east or northeast. Perhaps, Ugaki suggested, the American task force was just over the horizon. Chief of Staff Koyanagi informed him that fuel supplies, especially for the destroyers, were too low to go charging about. Ugaki insisted that after they destroyed the enemy, the battleships could refuel the destroyers at night. A stone-faced Kurita ignored his pleadings. After 5 p.m., with the sun sinking in the west and Kurita on a westerly course for the San Bernardino Strait, a message finally came. It was from the previously incommunicado Admiral Ozawa, apparently still alive, somewhere to the north. Halsey's 400-plus carrier planes had devastated Ozawa's fleet during the morning of the 25th. Ozawa had started with only 13 planes to defend the fleet, and all of them had been shot down by 9:30 a.m. One by one, Ozawa's 4 carriers were hit and sunk. As Ozawa's flagship, the venerable Zuikaku, began to settle, Ozawa told his staff that he was going down with his ship. His chief of staff, Admiral Toshikazu Omai, had to have Ozawa forcibly removed from the bridge. Transferred to a destroyer, then to the cruiser Oyodo shortly after 11 a.m., Ozawa remained bent on self-sacrifice. He telegraphed that he was launching a night torpedo attack on Halsey's forces with his remaining cruiser and called on Kurita, wherever he was, to join him. None of Ozawa's earlier messages from the Zuikaku had reached Kurita, thanks to the broken radio transmitter. But the communications gear aboard the Oyodo, which had served at times as a headquarters ship, was still in working order, and Ozawa's message, relayed through a Japanese communications center in Japan, caught up to Kurita about 40 miles from the strait. Kurita heard Ozawa's appeal and ignored it. He was not about to turn around yet again and accompany Ozawa in his pursuit of martyrdom. At 7:25 p.m., just as he was about to enter the treacherous strait on a darkening sea, Kurita received a message from Combined Fleet Headquarters. If there is an opportunity to do so, Headquarters commanded, Kurita was to make a night attack on the enemy and mop up its remnants. This order would have been laughable if Kurita's bleary-eyed staff had been capable of any feeling beyond numbly trying to stay awake. Their response can only be described as a joke. One wonders if the staffer who wrote it, probably Koyanagi, was smiling bitterly as he thought of the proper doublespeak to send back to Tokyo. At 9:30 p.m., as it passed through the strait back into the Sibuyan Sea, the Kurita fleet signalled headquarters. "We are of the opinion that the situation may offer excellent opportunity for the shore-based Air Force units to strike the first blow against the enemy and gain control of the air." In other words, Kurita expected to be bombed in the morning and was asking for air cover that would not be forthcoming. The messages coming into flag plot aboard USS New Jersey in the early afternoon of the 25th were painful to read. As Halsey's fleet plunged southward, Halsey received a series of distress signals from Kincaid in Leyte Gulf. The messages were confusing, as Kurita circled and changed his mind, and owing to the wretched bottleneck at Manus, delivered 1 or 2 hours late and out of order. The Japanese fleet was descending on Leyte Gulf. No, it wasn't. Yes, it was. Now it was headed north. "Each message tore you apart a little bit more," recalled John Lawrence, the Air Combat Intelligence officer. "There was nothing you could do but suffer. It felt like getting stomped on." Lawrence had never had an easy relationship with Mike Cheek, the squirrely, nearly mute naval intelligence man. But Cheek opened up a little to Lawrence that morning, lamenting Halsey's failure to safeguard the San Bernardino Strait. Cheek was deeply distraught, possibly blaming himself for not pushing harder to leave the battle line at the strait while sending the carriers north. Lawrence's deputy, John Marshall, found Cheek in his stateroom, slumped over with his head in his hands, groaning, and it could have been the greatest victory since Trafalgar. After the giddiness of the morning, when victory had seemed so close at hand, recalled Lawrence. The Department of Dirty Tricks did not realize that they had been tricked. Indeed, Halsey would not admit that he had been lured by a Japan. The afternoon was a brutal letdown, sea deception, even after the Japanese revealed the plan in post-war interrogations. But Halsey's staff knew that they had been on the verge of sinking Ozawa's cripples with their great guns, only to turn around and head off on a wild goose chase. Halsey tried to keep his chin up. He had headed south with 4 battleships and a carrier task force for air cover, leaving 2 carrier task forces and 2 battleships in the north to finish off the Japanese carriers. They, too, turned south at the end of the day and escaped Ozawa's feeble counterattack. Shortly after 3 p.m., in a last lunge to reach Kurita before he could escape, Halsey pulled his 2 fastest battleships, his own flagship and the Jawa, out of the fleet and sent them flying, at flank speed 35 knots, toward the San Bernardino Strait. He informed Kincaid that they would arrive there at about 1 a.m. on the 26th. Then he repaired to his office to write his own version of history. The first step was to declare victory. As night fell, he radioed Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Admiral Nimitz. The Japanese Navy has been beaten and routed and broken by the 3rd and 7th Fleets. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King was a little wary when Nimitz passed on Halsey's message. It didn't seem to square with the desperate cable traffic that had been flowing in all day. But, as naval historian E.B. Potter wrote, the Navy's hand was forced by MacArthur. The Army General had issued his own victory communiqué. Not to be outdone by the Army, the Navy wanted to claim credit first. Navy Secretary James Forrestal was anxious about getting ahead of the facts, but the Navy's pride was at stake. When President Roosevelt called reporters into the Oval Office on October 25th, October 26th in the Pacific, he read them a paraphrase of Halsey's victory message to Nimitz. U.S. defeats Japanese Navy, bannered the New York Times. President elated, gives news from Halsey that foe is defeated, damaged, routed. The headlines were not wrong. The Japanese had been dealt a terrible blow. The Japanese Navy was crippled. Luck, heroism, and Japan's exhaustion had saved the day. But the triumphalism obscured the reality of Taffy 3's ordeal and Halsey's misjudgment. Despite his preemptive PR strike on MacArthur, Halsey knew he had some explaining to do with Nimitz. That night of the 25th, as the New Jersey's enormous engines throbbed at maximum power for the run south, Halsey sat in his cabin writing his battle report. Halsey related a fairly straightforward account of bombing the Japanese center force in the Sibuyan Sea on the 24th, then came to the tricky part, explaining why he left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Halsey's words reveal how defensive he felt. He wrote, "As it seemed childish to me to guard statically San Bernardino Strait, I concentrated Task Force 38 during the night and steamed north to attack the northern force at dawn. I believed the center force had been so heavily damaged in the Sibuyan Sea that it could no longer be a serious menace to the 7th Fleet." Later, naval historians would have a field day with Halsey's use of the words childish and static. As Admiral Samuel Elot Morrison wrote, subtly twisting the knife, the battle line might have been detached to guard San Bernardino Strait, not statically, but actively. Shortly after midnight, a destroyer racing ahead of the New Jersey detected a Japanese destroyer crawling along the north coast of Sama, heading for the strait. She was the Nowaki, a straggler from Kurita's fleet, left behind to rescue survivors from a sinking cruiser. Halsey sent a pair of cruisers ahead to finish her off. When the Nowaki blew up, shortly after 1 a.m., Halsey could feel the shock wave 15 miles away. Halsey watched the Nowaki burning on the horizon. In his memoir, he wrote, "It was the first and only surface action I saw during my entire career." As night fell and the moon came out, the men of the Johnston began to feel the cold. Shivering uncontrollably, sailor Joe Check warmed himself by urinating in his pants. Some men began to sing. Others prayed aloud. Silhouetted against the moon, a ship approached, and the men began to yell and wave. Lieutenant Welch studied the pagoda-shaped superstructure and realized that the ship was a Japanese destroyer, probably the Nowaki, heavily laden with men from a sunken Japanese cruiser, steaming toward the San Bernardino Strait. "She's Japanese!" Welch called out, and the men instantly quieted. The ship passed within 100 yards and vanished in the darkness. After midnight, the moon set, and the sea and sky plunged into blackness. Clint Carter, the Texan, had belted himself to his shipmate Chuck Campbell, who had belted himself to a life raft that was overflowing with wounded men. Carter felt a sudden tug, then screamed, "Shark!" and crawled up Campbell's back, dragging him under. Campbell came up spluttering. The shark struck again and down they went. Fortunately, the sea monster had bitten mostly kapok. Carter had lost his life jacket, and he was bleeding badly from teeth marks on both sides of his back. But he was still alive. He was permitted to crawl into the crowded raft with the wounded. The screams began. There would be a flash of phosphorescence, furious splashing, a cry of shock and pain. Then silence as men vanished, dragged into the depths. The sharks only lightly bit a few men, possibly because the man-eaters were sated by the sudden harvest of corpses, the hundreds of men who had died at sea within a few square miles. A shark tore off Lieutenant Welch's pants and underwear, but only grazed his buttocks. For others, the wounds were more severe. The chief gunner's mate was bitten so hard on the thigh that his bones were crushed. A man whose stomach had been torn out lay in the raft begging to be put out of his misery. Someone produced a gun. It misfired. Another sailor took a knife and cut the man's throat. The wounded were dying. Lieutenant Bechdel, his morphine worn off, was no longer singing but screaming for a painkiller. His agony ended when he perished before dawn. The burn victims, suffering horribly from the salt water on their raw skin, cried out, then whimpered, then fell silent. Their life jackets were removed and given to the men who needed them. Friends bade farewell. "Bill, you go with Jesus now," Ed Takunen said to his buddy from the radio shack, Bill Williams. "You go with Christ." Then he gently pushed him off the raft. The resourceful Joe Check undressed Donald Coleman, who had been mortally wounded when Gun 52 took a direct hit. Check took off Coleman's life preserver and his shirt, which could be used as a screen against the brutal sun of the coming day. Overwhelmed by sadness, Check watched as Coleman's body slowly drifted downward into the deep. At dawn on October 26th, Halsey's ships swept east of Samar, looking for survivors. The Japanese swimmers were as thick as water bugs, recorded Halsey in his memoir. He was eating breakfast when Bill Kitchell, his personal staff officer, burst in and cried, "My God Almighty, Admiral, the little men's are all over the place. Are we going to stop and pick 'em up?" Halsey responded, "Not until we've picked up our own boys." Halsey picked up a few downed American flyers, but he did not find the men of the Johnston, or the nearly 1,000 still missing men of the other Taffy 3 ships sunk in part because of his misjudgment, the Howell, the Samuel B. Roberts, and the Gambier Bay. Halsey did plot the position of Japanese survivors, along with wind and tide data, so destroyers could return and pick up some prisoners for interrogation. "I ordered our destroyers, bring in cooperative Nip Flotsam for an intelligence sample. Non-cooperators would probably like to join their ancestors and should be accommodated," Halsey recalled, adding parenthetically, "I didn't want to risk their getting ashore, where they could reinforce the Japanese garrison." The destroyers picked up 6 IJN sailors. On the morning of October 26th, the first wave of American planes found Kurita's fleet at 8:34 a.m. By 9:45, the Yamato had been hit twice by bombs on the bow, and the cruiser Noshiro was disabled by torpedoes. At 10:40 a.m. came the second wave, this time large land-based B-24 bombers. Giant waterspouts rose up all around the Yamato. Struck 3 times on the bow, she had to flood her aft compartments with 2,000 tons of water, the weight of a destroyer escort, to keep trim. As the Yamato swung to avoid one stick of bombs, another bomb caught the wing of the bridge. Splinters of steel sliced into Admiral Koyanagi's right buttock. Petty Officer Koitabashi's lookout post was sprayed with shrapnel. The man to the right of him was decapitated. The man on the left was disemboweled. Koitabashi was riddled with more than 20 pieces. 60 years later, several of the pieces of the hard metal could be felt under the skin of his foot and ankle. As Koitabashi was carried off, he heard badly wounded men crying, "Kill me! Kill me!" He caught sight of Admiral Kurita looking quiet and subdued. The commander-in-chief was wearing a short-sleeved white tropical uniform. Across the bridge, Admiral Ugaki was in full dress whites. Kurita's staff wore flak jackets. Ugaki's staff wore none. This was the last of their attack against the main force. "Surely we had had enough," Ugaki wrote in his diary that night. "The enemy cleaned up the sea thoroughly, leaving nothing, with the feeling of a victor disposing of the remnant of the defeated enemy." He added a wistful note, "We also had times like that some time ago." The next day, the Yamato buried 29 men at sea. "I felt refreshed taking a bath after a long time," wrote Ugaki. "A Kapok life jacket remains buoyant for about 20 hours. On the morning of the second day, Bill Mercer took his off and watched it sink. Broiling in the sun, the men of the Johnston were beginning to break down and drink salt water. They would hallucinate, have convulsions, and die. Their visions were vivid and varied. Native girls bringing tropical fruit, a case of beer, a bar just down the street. A few men saw Captain Evans. One officer announced that he wanted to join him on the mountaintop and just swam away. Exhaustion was taking a toll. Men would fall asleep and drift off. Some snapped to when their faces hit the water. Others stopped caring. "If you slept, you died," recalled James Johnston, a sailor. "If you took morphine, you died. Some men would do anything to live." Johnson had watched a shipmate chew through the tendon that attached his nearly severed hand to his arm. But the man had no way of stopping the bleeding, and he died anyway. By the second night, it was every man for himself. The conversation and the prayers died away. Men who had helped the wounded onto rafts now waited for the wounded to die so they could replace them. Lieutenant Hagan had become delirious. Command, such as it was, fell to Lieutenants DeGardi and Welch. They could see Samar Island in the distance to the west, and with an easterly wind, Degardi had the idea of trying to sail there. He erected a tiny sail on one of the life rafts with 2 paddles and a shirt, and asked some sailors to paddle and kick. The sail collapsed. The men gave up. Degardi coped as best he could. When a sailor went berserk, he knocked him out and tied him to the raft. As they floated along, Degardi looked down and saw a group of sharks drifting in the shadow of the raft. One was huge, about 15 to 20 feet. Degardi told Welch to look down, but motioned him to keep his mouth shut. There was no point in alerting the others. The second night passed in a nightmare of hallucination and screams. Almost half the 270 men who had gone into the water after the Johnston sank had died or disappeared. As the sun rose on the third day, Bobby Chastain looked around and saw men who barely looked like men anymore. Their faces and shoulders were raw with sunburn, their lips were grotesquely swollen and blistered, and their eyes were bloodshot, dead, or haunted. Then, as Chastain recalled, a miracle occurred. He saw, far on the horizon, several small ships approaching. Through his badly sunburned eyes he saw a familiar and glorious sight streaming from the masts of the ships, the stars and stripes of the American flag. The ships were LCLS, landing ships sent out by the 7th Fleet. The Navy, after initial confusion and delay, had not given up on them after all. For a moment the men of the Johnston thought they were going to be killed by their own men. Gunners on the bows of the ships were blazing away with machine guns. But then the men in the water realized that the gunners were shooting at circling sharks. A voice called out from the lead ship, "Who won the World Series last year?" The answer came back, "To hell with baseball. Get us out of this water." Slowly, painfully, 141 survivors were pulled from the water. Most of them lay down on the deck and went to sleep. A couple of Japanese planes strafed the LCIs as they steamed back to Leyte Gulf. The men of the Johnston slept through the air raid. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. It had been confused, tragic, deadly, and heroic, and it is largely forgotten, though not entirely. Henry Wright in a post-battle analysis. The vision of Sprague's 3 destroyers, the Johnston, the Hoel, and the Heermann, charging out of the smoke and rain straight towards the main batteries of Kurita's battleships and cruisers, can endure as a picture of the way Americans fight when they don't have superiority. Our school children should know about that incident. Our enemies should ponder it. In 4 days, from October 23rd to October 26th, the Americans had sunk 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Japanese had sunk 3 carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Some 13,000 men had died, most of them Japanese. The Japanese Navy was effectively finished as a fighting force. It was now nothing more than a weapon of despair. But Japanese spirit had become a Japanese death wish, and there was still a great deal of dying to be done. On November 11th, 1944, 2 weeks after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Carnes Weeks, Halsey's doctor and wardroom morale officer, wrote his wife a letter. The New Jersey was at anchor at Ulithi, the coral atoll in the Pacific where men could have a drink and a breather. Halsey and his staff were finally resting for a few days after 2 months at sea. The Admiral asked me to go with him alone to visit the hospital ships and see the wounded doctor. Weeks wrote his wife, Margaret, "God, he is something. He hates to see these poor kids and just makes himself do it. You ought to see the faces of these poor kids when he comes in a ward, even the badly burned faces, just the eyes showing. He comes in and jokes, shakes hands, tells stories, and cusses a lot about the Japanese." Halsey had to continue to play the bull, but it was an effort for him. Heartless about picking up Japanese survivors, he was nonetheless torn up by the suffering of his own men. Visiting the wounded took some moral courage. Some commanders could not bring themselves to do it. Halsey apparently revealed himself a little to Weeks, not admitting error, but at least showing his emotional side. In the same letter home, Piggy Weeks wrote, "He opens his heart to me when he and I are alone. What a wonderfully sweet character he has under his military brusqueness, and boy, how soft his heart is. It just him to hear of dead, missing, and wounded." Halsey's confessional was brief and exceptional. He was still the lion of the wardroom. On his 62nd birthday on October 30th, his Filipino steward had made him a cake in the shape of a battleship and he had raised a glass with his department of dirty tricks. In the aftermath of the battle, Radio Tokyo was still screaming, "We dare the American people to ask where Halsey is." And Halsey declared to his staff, "If Commander-in-Chief, Pacific would let me, I would send 'em MV latitude and longitude." But the conviviality and bluster had been forced that day. True, the Japanese had been overwhelmingly defeated, but Halsey had missed his chance for immortality. His men knew that the verdict of history on their actions would be, at best, mixed. Awarded a Navy Cross by Halsey for his role in the battle, Chief of Staff Mick Carney did not like to wear the decoration because he told his daughter Betty he felt that he hadn't deserved it. There was no victory celebration in the Third Fleet. In Pearl Harbor, Halsey's carrier commander, Admiral Mitcher, gave a briefing on the battle to Admiral Nimitz at Navy Headquarters. The briefing lasted all of 3 minutes. Mitcher apparently had nothing good to say, so he said nothing. Respectful of his line commanders, sensitive to Mitcher's obvious exhaustion, Nimitz did not press. In Washington, the more volatile Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief, was feeling less forgiving. On the morning of the battle, Admiral King had paced, blue with rage, damning Halsey for failing to guard the San Bernardino Strait, according to ADM, Joseph Jocko Clark, who was in King's office at the time. In November, King told Nimitz that Halsey was tired and should be given a rest. General MacArthur responded to the bungled victory with heroic hypocrisy. For the record, on October 29th, MacArthur sent a gushing telegram to the commander of the Third Fleet. "We have cooperated with you so long that we are accustomed and expect your brilliant successes, and you have more than sustained our fullest anticipations. Everyone here has a feeling of complete confidence and inspiration when you go into action in our support." On a copy of this telegram in MacArthur's records, in a note penciled at the bottom, is the real account of what transpired between Halsey and MacArthur. The note was written and signed by General Richard Sutherland, MacArthur's Chief of Staff. This follows verbal castigation of Halsey by General MacArthur, who repeatedly charged him with failure to execute his mission of covering the Leyte operations. When Halsey failed to get into the Battle of Leyte Gulf, thus threatening the destruction of our shipping, General MacArthur repeatedly stated that Halsey should be relieved and would welcome his relief as he no longer has confidence in him. Even so, MacArthur cut off his subordinates when they began to mock Halsey at dinner. "That's enough," MacArthur bellowed, pounding the table for attention. "Leave the bull alone. He's still a fighting admiral in my book." To his credit, Halsey did not shy away from other men who had reason to scorn him. At Ulithi, he came up to Taffy 3's admiral, Clifton Ziggy Sprague, and said, "Ziggy, I didn't know whether you would speak to me or not." Sprague replied, "Why, Admiral Bill, I'm not mad at you." Halsey graciously told Sprague, "I want you to know I think you wrote the most glorious page in American naval history." Halsey had no one, with the partial exception of Dr. Weeks, to whom he could truly unburden himself. His family ties were weak. Suffering from manic depression, Fan was unreachable, even by letter, and Halsey suffered for it. His son, Bill, was also apparently distant. In December, Dr. Weeks wrote his wife that Halsey just got pictures of Bill's wedding. Imagine. Bill has never written him. What a funny family they are, and he feels it so very much. Halsey sought consolation in other ways. In his role as sea dog, he had a well-deserved reputation for seeking a girl in every port. One of Weeks's jobs was to keep Halsey and his staff entertained off-duty. "I am running a little party for the Admiral and getting some nurses from a hospital ship. God help them, the nurses, I mean." Weeks wrote his wife from Ulithi after the difficult visit to see the wounded aboard the hospital ship on November 11th. A week later, Weeks wrote his wife, "The nurses were grand, good sports. They had been working very hard with the wounded and were just as ready for a break as we were." Nurses needed to be good sports. An admiral's aide to the chief of nursing aboard a hospital ship described a nurses' party with Admiral Halsey and his staff. After the meal, one of the celebrants flipped a live cigarette in the wastebasket, which caught fire, whereupon an officer grabbed a CO bottle, stuck the cone in the basket, and quickly extinguished the flames. Then he pushed the nozzle up the dress of one of the nurses and squirted her between the legs. She let out a scream as the dry ice burned. Other officers grabbed bottles and started chasing nurses around the wardroom. Halsey and his men had only a few days to debauch in Ulithi. By Thanksgiving, they were dodging kamikazes off the Philippines. Yesterday, we had a very severe attack by Japanese planes, Weeks wrote his wife on November 27th. I have never seen anything like it so far this war. Planes diving and exploding all around us. 3 carriers were damaged, the Intrepid severely. An instant after she was hit, she was wrapped in flames, recalled Halsey in his memoir. Blazing gasoline cascaded down her sides. Explosions rocked her. Then oily black smoke, rising thousands of feet, hid everything but her bow. At first, Halsey had dismissed the kamikazes as a sort of token terror, a tissue paper dragon. He did not believe the Japanese, for all their killing traditions, could muster enough recruits to make such a corps really effective. But his disdain for the Japanese gave way to real concern as he watched his carriers burn. Halsey's fortunes continued to worsen in mid-December when the Third Fleet sailed into a typhoon. It was a particularly vicious storm, and during the height of it, Admiral Kearney had grave doubts that the mighty New Jersey would survive. It's difficult to describe the sickening lurch of that ship when she went way over, he recalled. The enormous battleship would hang in the trough and then slowly right. The New Jersey was tossed as if she were a canoe, recalled Halsey. We were buffeted from one bulkhead to another. We could not hear our own voices above the uproar. What it was like on a destroyer 1/20th the New Jersey's size, I can only imagine. The Typhoon, later fictionalized by Herman Wouk in the Caine Mutiny, was deadlier than the Japanese. Top-heavy because they lacked ballast as they were waiting to fuel, 3 destroyers turned turtle and vanished, taking with them almost 800 men. Because the destroyers could have been temporarily ballasted with seawater, Halsey was later criticized by a court of inquiry for poor seamanship in waiting too long to abandon refueling operations. As usual, he was pressing to get after the enemy with an airstrike. Halsey was determined to find and sink the battleships that had escaped from the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In January, the Third Fleet roamed the coast of Indochina, launching air attacks, shooting up Japan's dwindling merchant fleet, but finding few significant warships. Halsey's forces sank but a single light cruiser, the Kashiz, formerly used as a training ship and submarine headquarters. At the end of January, Halsey was relieved by Admiral Spruance. The change of command was all part of an orderly transition, long scheduled, to rest Halsey and his staff while Spruance took over for the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Halsey did not exactly return to headquarters wreathed in laurels. On the other hand, he was not castigated or shunned. He was denied, for the time being, a 5th star for the newly created rank of Fleet Admiral. Even so, Admiral King had cooled off and decided that Admiral Kincaid was primarily to blame for the failure to watch San Bernardino Strait. Halsey's welcome-back meeting with King was only tightly awkward. The first words out of Halsey's mouth when he entered King's office were, "I made a mistake in that battle." Kang held up his hand. "You don't have to tell me any more. You've got a green light on everything you did." But Halsey wasn't referring to his failure to guard the San Bernardino Strait. His only mistake, he told King, was to turn south when the Japanese Ozawa's fleet were right under my guns. King, no doubt recalling Nimitz's pointed, "Where is Task Force 34 telegram?" replied, "No, it wasn't a mistake. You couldn't have done otherwise." That same month, when the post-Typhoon Court of Inquiry blamed Halsey for errors in judgment in the loss of men and ships, King softened the verdict. After errors in judgment, King inserted the phrase from insufficient information and changed from a commendable desire to meet military requirements to firm determination to meet military requirements. Nimitz had already toned down at Navy's analysis of the Battle of Leyte Gulf because it was too tough on Halsey. The top brass understood that criticism of Halsey could not be allowed to creep into the public press. Halsey was the Navy's hero. He could not be besmirched. The Japanese would have understood. It was all a matter of saving face. The Japanese government responded to defeat at Leyte Gulf by declaring victory. At the end of October, Radio Tokyo reported that Japanese forces now have complete air and sea superiority on and around Leyte. There were some inconvenient facts to be covered up. Several hundred of the 1,000 survivors of the Musashi were virtually imprisoned on an island in the inland sea, and the rest were formed into a naval infantry brigade to fight to the last man in defense of Manila, besieged by MacArthur's advancing army. Admiral Kurita was beached, but in a dignified way. Under his dovish friend, Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, Vice Minister of the Navy, Kurita became Commandant of the Naval Academy. As early as 1942, Inoue had started protecting naval cadets from being sent into the fleet. Inoue wanted them to be leaders in post-war Japan, not martyrs. English language, like jazz music, had been largely driven from Japanese culture, but Inoue made sure that Etajima cadets learned English. By installing Kurita as its head, Inoue hoped to keep Etajima from becoming an academy for rashness. Kurita went home to his comfortable house in a naval suburb of Tokyo, where he kept an archery target in the garden and a western sitting room for guests. Kurita's teenage daughter Shigeko was shocked to see how gaunt her father had become. Kurita refused to speak about the war and sat quietly drinking sake. Still, Shigeko was happy to have him home. Her family had been praying for his safety at the Meiji Shrine. In February, Kurita and his family moved from Tokyo to the commandant's quarters at the academy on the island of Etajima, in the inland sea across from the great naval port of Kure. They left the capital just in time. The American B-29 raids were intensifying. Admiral Ugaki celebrated the birthday of the Emperor Meiji on November 3rd with a bitter poem, "Day of Chrysanthemum brings devil's cloud with enemy wings." Relieved of command, he drifted from one farewell party to another, recalling an old adage, "Drinking after a long time dry makes a man with no job tight." Attached to the Navy General Staff without much to do, he tried to be philosophical. Like a floating weed, he wrote, "I have to leave it to the stream." Late November found him at the Navy Ministry in Tokyo, feeling ashamed, he wrote, of the thin results yielded by the sacrifices at Leyte Gulf. That day, November 27th, the B-29s hit Tokyo for the second time. Awakened by air raid sirens, Ugaki stood in his garden listening to the drone of bombers high in the clouds overhead. "A bomb dropped on the Togo shrine," wrote Ugaki. "It was really irritating. Experiencing domestic life for the first time in many months, he was shocked by the small rations, a slice of funny little fish and 2 leaves of vegetable. He poked about in his flower garden and was having a few drinks when his son, Hiromitsu, who had just been commissioned a surgeon sub-lieutenant in the Naval Medical Corps, came home. "Father and son at last," he wrote. "I was very glad to see he had grown up to be a man, getting to be an officer." On December 18th, Ugaki was granted, along with 6 other admirals, an audience with the emperor. "How can I repay such an honor?" he wondered. "My thoughts ran wild seeking ways to save the empire," he wrote on the last day of 1944, the year of the decisive battle that had somehow failed to turn the tide of the war. On that dreary New Year's Eve, Ugaki wrote, "Average people have now realized the gravity of the situation, but only too late." Indeed, a touch of cynicism was beginning to creep into the public mood. On November 8th, Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso had compared Leyte to Tenozan, a mythical Japanese victory. But by New Year's Day 1945, Prime Minister Koiso announced in his national radio address that the Philippine island of Luzon was now Tenozan. Tokyoites quipped, "Koiso even seems to move mountains." After the failure of the show plan, Emperor Hirohito had inquired of his ministers, "Was not the use of our warships inappropriate at Leyte Gulf?" In the stilted politeness of the throne room, such a question amounted to an imperial rebuke. And yet Hirohito was still chasing the chimera of decisive battle. The emperor was a victim of his own stubbornness and the deceit of the military, which continued to swallow its own propaganda. At Leyte, instruments of surrender had been prepared for General MacArthur, along with a Japanese victory communique to be read on the beach. Hirohito still believed, after 3 years of increasingly disastrous war, that one great military victory would drive the Americans to the negotiating table and force them to sue for peace. He could not see that the United States was headed in precisely the opposite direction, increasingly determined to exact an unconditional surrender. The proper course, the emperor's advisers believed, was to bleed the Americans without regard to Japan's sacrifice. Admiral Ugaki was a natural choice for such a mission. In February, he was summoned by police telephone to the home of the Navy Minister and given his new duties, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, guarding Japan's southern flank. The 5th Air Fleet was to be a suicide air force, Without a fleet, the Navy was committed to human sacrifice. Production lines were devoted to turning out planes, Kaiten and Oka bombs. Ugaki was thrilled with his assignment. It offered the key to the gate of the imperial fortunes, he wrote. He would be headquartered in Japan's southern island of Kyushu, warmed by tropical currents. Ugaki was glad to get out of war-torn Tokyo. Without hot water, he recorded, his piles had become worse. Ugaki's first mission was to mount a suicide attack on the American warships anchored at Ulithi. Some 24 long-range twin-engine bombers were mustered to plunge into carriers and battleships anchored at the atoll, where they were readying for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa. The night before the raid, Ugaki served an elaborate banquet for the pilots, offering blowfish, a rare delicacy, and many bottles of sake. Speeches were made, toasts were drunk, tears were shed. But after the mission was launched in the morning, it was aborted and the planes turned around and came home. Intelligence was reporting that the American carriers and battleships had departed from Ulithi. It was all a mistake. The American fleet was still at its moorings in Ulithi. But Tokyo headquarters was distracted and in an uproar. B-29s had firebombed Tokyo that night, March 9th to 10th, using high winds and incendiaries to create an inferno that destroyed 261,000 homes and killed more than 100,000 people. Ugaki dutifully sent out his bombers once again the next day. 11 of 24 planes reported engine problems, and only 6 reached Uti. They caused mild damage to one carrier. The raid was a complete failure, Ugaki gloomily recorded, but he kept sending more young men to die. The plan to thwart the invasion of Okinawa in late March and early April was to overwhelm American defenses with waves of kikusuis, suicide planes by the hundreds. Novice pilots, all volunteer at this stage, were herded by more experienced pilots toward their targets. The assault was called Tengo, Operation Heaven. The attacks did do great damage, battering hundreds of ships, including Admiral Spruance's flagship, the Indianapolis. But the toll was not nearly as great as Ugaki wished for or feverishly imagined. If one were to believe Ugaki's diary entries, his kizkuswis sank every American carrier and battleship many times over. Again and again, Ugaki would deliriously report wildly exaggerated numbers. Yet he would lament, "Each day we try to finish the enemy task force, and yet they can't be finished." One senses, reading Ugaki's diary, a man becoming unhinged. He explains to himself that he can send young men off to die with a smile because I had made up my mind to follow the example of those young boys some day. He went on, "I was glad to see that my weak mind, apt to be moved to tears, had reached this stage." Ugaki's demented, bloody-mindedness was shared, not universally, but widely at the upper levels of command. In April, the Navy decided that the battleship Yamato should become a suicide ship. With its crew of over 3,000 men, the Yamato was to sail to Okinawa and beach there, to become a giant gun platform until her doom. Long before she reached Okinawa, American planes found the Yamato and her escorts. Lanced by scores of torpedoes and bombs, the mighty super battleship began to founder. As the Yamato heeled over, the fleet commander, Admiral Seiichi Ito, announced, "Stop the operation," and went into his sea cabin to shoot himself. Young officers had been issued lengths of rope which they hung from their belts, so that when the time came they would resist the urge to escape and instead lash themselves to the sinking ship. In a memoir, Requiem for Battleship Yamato, a young ensign, Mitsuru Yoshida, described the last minutes on the bridge. "I see the navigation officer, a commander, responsible for the operation of the ship, and the assistant navigation officer, a lieutenant junior grade, his assistant, face each other and bind themselves together. Knees rubbing and shoulders touching, they attempt to bind each other's legs and hips to the binnacle. Seeing them, I naturally reach for my side, touching the line readied some time ago. That such might be the end of a special attack was something we fully foresaw. 'What are you doing? You young ones, swim!' Chief of Staff strikes an angry pose, lacing his angry words with blows of his fist. He hits me from the side. I have no choice but to follow his orders and, changing my mind, throw away the line. Still, my resentment does not go away. The popular slogan of the time, Yoshida recalled, was 100 million deaths rather than surrender. But as time went on, some young Japanese men had to be persuaded to volunteer for the Special Attack Forces. By late April, even the obtuse Ugaki observed that his special attack squadrons were becoming less effective. In Tokyo, Ugaki's family dependents wanted to flee the burning city. Ugaki at first told them to do their patriotic duty and stay, then relented and let them leave. His family's chief concern, at least as Ugaki expressed it in his diary, was for the protection of his military uniforms and decorations, stored at his home for safekeeping. Ugaki himself had taken to living in a cave on Kyushu in order to avoid the American bombers. He was becoming increasingly delusional, claiming in his diary on April 13th that the Gen Operation Num 1 killed Roosevelt. In early May, he mourned the suicide of Adolf Hitler, but hoped that the Nazi leader's spirit would live on in the German people. His one relaxation was hunting and horseback riding, though he complained that the bomb craters now pitting Japan were dangerous to the horses' legs. At the end of May, Admiral Halsey took back command of the Big Blue Fleet from Admiral Spruance. He promptly and unbelievably sailed back into a typhoon. No ships were sunk, but the flight decks of 2 carriers buckled and the bow of a cruiser ripped off. This time the Court of Inquiry squarely blamed Halsey. The Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, wanted to retire the commander of the Third Fleet, but he was blocked by Admirals King and Nimitz. The bull, they argued once again, was too much of a symbol to the troops. In July, the cover of Time magazine showed Halsey, eyes glinting, jaw jutting, before a portrait of a giant tidal wave about to crush an ancient bearded emperor in a silk robe with a quiver of arrows on his back. Some of the flyers and sailors aboard the carriers were beginning to ridicule Halsey. Administrator Jocko Clark, task group commander aboard the Yorktown, and his staff wrote a parody screenplay of a dialogue between a publicity hound Halsey, bellowing about his plans to rub out these yellow-bellied little mens, and his weary, exasperated boss, Chester Nimitz. In June and July, the Third Fleet roamed up and down the coast of Japan, looking for ships to sink, but good naval targets were far and few between. The heavy work, bombing Japan's cities, was being done by Army Air Force B-29s from Guam and now Okinawa, the last bastion in Japan's chain of island defences. The next invasion would be of Japan itself. Admiral Nimitz intended to let Spruance command the invasion of the southernmost island, Kyushu, scheduled in November, with Halsey's fleet further offshore flying cover. King and Nimitz did not trust Halsey to handle complex amphibious operations. Halsey's fellow admirals were quietly questioning Halsey's competence. Administrator Ted Sherman, a task group commander, agreed with a fellow admiral that Halsey has not been thinking straight lately. After the war, Admiral Clark would tell naval historian Clark Reynolds that the war had become too complicated for Bull Halsey. Does the enemy intend to destroy all of the cities in this country? Admiral Ugaki wondered in his diary on June 18th. The answer was yes, unless Japan surrendered unconditionally. We could bomb and burn them until they quit, General Curtis LeMay told the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. The only hitch was that by October he would run out of cities to burn. By mid-August, LeMay's 21st Bomber Command was scheduling burn jobs on no fewer than 16 urban industrial areas per operational day. Ugaki was preparing himself for the apocalypse by becoming a nihilist, he wrote in his diary, in order to clear the mind. In July, he proudly read in the Naval Gazette that he had been awarded the First Order of the Sacred Treasure for his achievements, and he inspected secret underground hangars where the Navy was building thousands of suicide boats for the American invasion. He was informed that he was now commander of all kamikaze planes, but ordered not to fly them. The Empire was holding back its Toko forces for the final battle, Ketsugo, the decisive operation. Japan was, in effect, preparing for mass suicide. The scale of the carnage is appalling to contemplate. The battle for Okinawa had cost 12,000 American lives and 200,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians. The death toll for the Battle of Kyushu alone would be many times that. The Japanese had more than 7,000 planes hidden in caves and tree groves. According to historian Richard Frank, the Japanese planned to saturate the invasion fleet with as many kamikazes in 3 hours as they had sent against Okinawa in 3 months. Schoolgirls, organized into the Patriotic Citizens Fighting Corps, were given bamboo spears and practiced bayoneting posters of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Japan had lost close to 3 million people. The country was facing mass famine. As many as 10 million people were suffering from serious malnutrition. The emperor and Japan's war leaders knew that the war was lost, but they did not know how to end it. One faction wanted to secretly negotiate a peace through the Soviet Union, but another group clung to the hope that Operation Ketsu would be so deadly that the Americans would agree not to occupy Japan or end the imperial system. American codebreakers watched the Japanese heading down both tracks, trying to enlist the Soviets with peace feelers, while at the same time preparing for Armageddon. Armed with their ultra-intelligence, it is no wonder that the Americans saw a potential trap, another Pearl Harbor, that the Japanese would try to lull them with diplomacy while girding for a violent surprise. As ever in this war between uncomprehending nations, mistrust led to escalation. President Harry Truman ended the war and launched a new and fearful age by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both cities were flattened in blinding flashes. In the meantime, on August 8th, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. Finally, Hirohito stopped his bitter hand-wringing. The emperor was worried about his jewels, literally. If the Americans invaded Japan, they might capture the imperial regalia, a sword, jewel, and mirror that were symbols of 2,600 years of Kokutai, the Japanese polity of divine imperial family and loyal subjects. Hirohito determined to surrender unconditionally if the Americans would allow the emperor to carry on as divine ruler. It was a close thing. The Americans rejected an initial secret peace offering that would have preserved considerable imperial authority during the occupation. The Americans demanded complete subordination of the emperor. During these delicate negotiations, Admiral Onishi, the creator of the kamikaze units, burst into a meeting of Japan's war rulers on August 13th to deliriously cry, "If we are prepared to sacrifice 20 million Japanese lives in a special attack effort, victory will be ours." When a Japanese diplomat explained to the emperor that he risked losing his throne, the emperor reluctantly accepted the American terms. Meanwhile, hot-headed army officers were plotting a coup to kill all the emperor's advisers. The last gasps of madness fizzled, in part because the army officers searching the palace could not find and destroy the recording of Hirohito's surrender speech. On August 15th, Japanese listening to their radios at noon heard a voice they had never before heard, the sacred crane, the Showa emperor, the reedy, thin voice of Hirohito. His speech was beautiful, if in parts a little mind-boggling. He never used the word surrender. He acknowledged, with breathtaking understatement, that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, but he told his people they would have to bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable and lay down their arms to avert not just the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also the total extinction of human civilization. Hirohito's subjects listened, and almost all obeyed. There was very little armed resistance against the Americans after Hirohito's speech. In Tokyo, commanders disarmed and took the propellers off aircraft to prevent fanatics from seizing them. Many military men tried to cover up their complicity in Japan's defeat or destroy evidence of atrocities that might be used in war crimes trials. For many days after the emperor's speech, it was sardonically said, the sky over Tokyo was black with the smoke of burning documents. Some officers turned their shame and anger on themselves. Hundreds committed madness, some in the painful, traditional way of killing. Admiral Onishi, the kamikaze creator, wrote, "I have never been so ashamed of myself," he wrote. Ugaki had already decided that he would lead the last kamikaze mission. His plan was to ram enemy vessels at Okinawa. He decided he was not guilty of insubordination, not exactly. At 4 p.m. he drank a last toast with his staff, stripped his dark green uniform of badges of rank, and picked up the short samurai sword given him by Admiral Yamamoto. At the airfield, 11 Swiss dive bombers had been lined up. Their 2-man crews, with rising sun headbands affixed, were standing at attention. Ugaki protested that he only wanted 5 planes to go with him, but the commander of the unit insisted on accompanying Ugaki at full strength. Ugaki turned to the pilots. "Will you all go with me?" he asked. The flight crews did not hesitate. "Yes, sir." they shouted, raising their right hands. A small crowd had gathered. Among the curious was Hiroshi Yasunaga, the floatplane pilot with Kurita's fleet who had survived Leyte Gulf and was now a reconnaissance pilot, temporarily but fortuitously grounded because of tuberculosis. Yasunaga watched as Ugaki tried to climb up on the wing of a plane. The kamikaze commander seemed a little plump, Yasunaga thought. He stifled a snicker when a non-commissioned officer was summoned to give Ugaki a shove from the rear to boost him into the rear seat. Ugaki saluted his officers and turned to salute the crowd. Yasunaga and 3 of his fellow pilots refused to return the salute. They believed that Ugaki should have chosen to die alone and not take 22 young men with him. The planes roared off against a setting sun. 3 later returned with engine trouble. At 7:24 p.m., as darkness was settling over Japan, Ugaki's last message was received. He was going to ram into the arrogant American ships, he vowed, displaying the real spirit of a Japanese warrior. Less than 15 minutes later, at about 7:40 p.m., the crew of LST-296 was unloading foodstuffs, but mostly drinking beer at the island of Ihejima off Okinawa when they heard aircraft engines. Some 7 or 8 planes came around the small island. As jazz music blared over the PA aboard LST-296, a few men waved and threw beer cans. Then the planes opened fire with machine guns and someone yelled, "They're Japanese! Kamikazes!" Lights were doused and men ran to their anti-aircraft guns. All of the kamikazes were shot down or crashed into the sea. In the morning, the men of LST-296 found the smouldering cockpit of one of the Japanese planes, crumpled upside down on the beach. It held 3 men, not the usual 2. The third man was dressed in a dark green uniform. His head was crushed and his right arm was missing. A small sword lay by his side. Soldiers came and tied ropes around the feet of the dead men and dragged them out of the cockpit using a jeep. Without ceremony, the corpses were buried in the sand. It is likely that Admiral Kurita heard and felt the atomic blast, and he may have seen the mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima, some 20 miles north of the island of Ihejima. The Naval Academy was partly sheltered by a small mountain, and the prevailing winds blew the radiation away. Kurita had long ago turned his back on the war. He was training his academy graduates to rebuild Japan. Some 50 Ihejima cadets had been aboard the Yamato before her suicide mission in April. Kurita had ordered the youngsters removed from the battleship. As commandant of Ihejima, Kurita stressed moral education. With his scholarly hand, Kurita took his brush and wrote, with elegant calligraphy in the ancient style, these 5 reflections for each cadet to ponder every night. Hast thou not acted against sincerity? Hast thou not felt ashamed of thy words and deeds? Hast thou not lacked vigour? Hast thou exerted all possible efforts? Hast thou not been slothful? On September 23, 1945, Kurita gave the last address to the cadets as Ihejima was formally closed. He told us, "You will be the light of rebuilding the empire." 999 recalled Manabu Yoshida, who graduated in the Imperial Naval Academy's last class that day. In his memoirs, Halsey wrote that Commander Moulton interrupted his breakfast on the morning of August 15th to show him the transcript of President Truman's proclamation of victory. "Yippee!" Halsey yelled and pounded on the shoulders of his staff. His chief of staff, Admiral Kearney, recalled that he and Halsey actually learned of Japan's surrender the night before, as they were on deck watching a film starring swimming champion Esther Williams. A messenger whispered in Halsey's ear that U.S. Army radio in Europe had picked up word of the Japanese surrender. Halsey made a derogatory and unprintable remark, remembered Kearney, and said, "Tets, just watch the picture." Halsey disapproved of the atom bomb. He thought it was unnecessary. He had predicted in midsummer that Japan was a house of cards that would collapse by October. Halsey was disappointed that the surrender allowed Hirohito to retain his throne. The Third Fleet had been forbidden to bomb the Emperor's palace in Tokyo because somebody had some panty-waist idea about not knocking off the Emperor, recalled Kearney. On August 27th, for the second time since he had been an ensign nearly 40 years before, Halsey steamed into Tokyo Harbour. Back in 1908, the Great White Fleet had been greeted by the legendary Admiral Togo. This time Halsey, at the head of the mightiest fleet in history, was greeted by a shabby Japanese destroyer, her gun muzzles pointed down, breeches open, torpedo tubes empty. 2 Japanese officials came aboard. One was Captain Otani, Kurita's old operations officer, now assigned to the Navy General Staff. Carney recalled that Otani looked like a caricature of a treacherous Japanese brute. Before deigning to meet his Japanese supplicants, Halsey required them to take a shower and relieved them of their ceremonial swords. When MacArthur later agreed to allow the Japanese officers to keep their sidearms, just as Grant had done for Lee's army at Appomattox, Halsey was appalled. He told MacArthur that the Japanese, unlike the Confederates, had not been an honorable foe. MacArthur, who rarely modified his stances to suit anyone, backed down and changed the order. Halsey mistrusted the Japanese to the end. After the formal cessation of hostilities on August 15th, he ordered his air patrols to keep watch for suicide planes and shoot them down, as he put it, in a friendly way. He arranged to have American submarines meet Japanese submarines at sea to disarm them and bring them into port. When Halsey went ashore at the Japanese base at Yokohama, he was revolted, he recalled, by the filth and the size of the rats. But Carney recalled that he was surprised by the deference of the Japanese they met, old men bowing and young boys giving them the V sign. Halsey and his men could not resist a sophomoric celebration. They ordered the best meal they could find at one of the only Tokyo hotels still standing, and when the check came, Halsey signed Hirohito. The formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd, aboard the veranda deck of the battleship Missouri, was carefully rehearsed. Halsey signaled the destroyer fetching the Japanese delegation not to offer coffee or cigarettes or any other courtesy. Nimitz, who had earlier issued a directive banning all racial slurs, countermanded Halsey's order. A table had been set up by the turret of a 16-inch gun. Senior American and Allied officers, standing erect, some in dress uniforms, some in workaday khakis, crowded around. The Japanese foreign minister, Mamoru Shigemitsu, who was to sign for the emperor, seemed to procrastinate. He fiddled with his hat, dropped his cane, shuffled papers, fumbled for his pen. Standing a few feet away, Halsey seethed. He later told MacArthur, "I wanted to slap him and tell him, 'Sign, damn you, sign!' But at last the deed was done, and MacArthur nudged Halsey and whispered, 'Start 'em now.' 'Aye, aye, sir,' said Halsey, and gave the prearranged signal. Before long, waves of B-29s and assorted Navy bombers and fighters by the hundreds were roaring overhead, lest the Japanese forget what they had been up against. According to Carney, Halsey's staff expected one of the Japanese generals to commit killing right there. There was one more mission remaining for Halsey. In Washington over the spring, Halsey had been asked by a reporter if the Emperor's palace was a target. "No," replied Halsey, though he allowed a B-29 might hit it by mistake. He hoped not. He added, "I'd hate to have them kill Hirohito's white horse because I want to ride it." In response to his flippancy, Halsey had been sent bridles, blankets, saddles, lariats, even spurs by various chambers of commerce and sheriff's offices around the United States. "My cabin in the resort began to look like a tack room," Halsey recalled. Sure enough, when Halsey arrived to inspect the American occupation troops in Tokyo, there was a white horse, not the white horse, Halsey recorded, but a reasonable facsimile, if a little swayback. Halsey gamely climbed aboard and grinned for the photographers. In the photograph he is trying to look jaunty, but he looks oddly sepulchral. He had been wasted by the war he won. On October 15th, 1945, Halsey returned home to a hero's welcome. He stood rigid, silent, alone on the veranda deck of his last flagship, the battleship USS South Dakota, as she passed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. According to a newspaper account, Halsey raised a gold-striped arm to wave, and cheers erupted along the span, jammed with spectators. "To hell with standing at attention," yelled a sailor, lined up with his mates on the bow. The homeward-bound swabbies began wildly cheering and waving. On deck, the band played "There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight." Halsey's victory tour took him to San Francisco, Los Angeles, Indianapolis, St. Louis, Boston, and Philadelphia. Halsey was showered in praise and ticker tape and presented with a silver tea service in his hometown of Elizabeth, New Jersey. In December, Halsey was given his Typhoon-delayed 5th stripe and made a fleet admiral. It was mostly a gesture by the top brass. Halsey had already announced his retirement. My only fear, Halsey wrote a friend, is that the extra stripe is going to interfere with my drinking arm. Halsey suffered from post-war letdown. It was a malady common to victorious generals and admirals. The tightly controlled Admiral Nimitz at length came to terms with the problem, but it killed Admiral King, wrote naval historian E.B. Potter. Halsey's great friend and carrier task force commander Admiral John Slew McCain had been the first victim. The day of the ceasefire, August 15th, McCain's chief for air operations captain, Jimmy Thuck, found McCain lying in his bunk in his sea cabin. "I feel lost," McCain confessed. "I don't know what to do. I know how to fight, but now I don't know whether I know how to relax or not. I am in an awful letdown. I do feel bad." McCain had wanted to go home and skip the surrender ceremony, but Halsey persuaded him to stay. The day afterward, McCain flew home to California, and the next day he died of a heart attack. Halsey drank too much. As a fleet admiral, he was attended to by a yeoman whose chief duty appeared to be refilling his glass with scotch. Remembering happy days at St. Anthony Hall, he took a job raising money for the University of Virginia, but he was remarkably unsuccessful at it, considering his hail fellow gifts. He was bored. Life at home with Fan was not easy. Suffering from mania, she talked constantly and often put him down. He, in turn, was abrupt with her. In Charlottesville, a visiting naval commander, A.K. Murray, who had been sent to paint Halsey's portrait, recalled an awkward scene. "Did I ever tell you," Fanny said, "about how you should never discount the power of women in the Navy?" Halsey cut in, "Oh, for God's sake, don't tell him that one." Mrs. Halsey ignored her husband and launched into a long story about wearing a low-cut dress and going for a walk at night in the garden with Admiral King in order to manipulate him to advance the career of another officer. In the summer of 1948, Halsey published his memoirs, Admiral Halsey's Story, as an 8-part series in the Saturday Evening Post. His version of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, self-serving and defensive, was sure to cause trouble. Admiral King rebuked him for his criticism of other officers, particularly his implicit criticism of King for allowing a divided command. Halsey's treatment of Kinkaid was shabby. In an offhand way, he blamed the 7th Fleet commander for Taffy 3's rude surprise by Kurita's fleet. "I wondered how Kinkaid had let Ziggy Sprague get caught like this," Halsey wrote. Kinkaid was incensed. Having finished with Halsey's portrait, Commander Murray went to paint Kinkaid's picture and mentioned Halsey's Saturday Evening Post article. Kinkaid became so angry that he refused to leave his office for lunch or answer the telephone. An aide found him lighting one cigarette from the last as he furiously paced about. Kinkaid's ire festered until he finally wrote a lucid and fairly persuasive rebuttal to Halsey that appeared in a book by the New York Times' military correspondent, Hanson Baldwin, in 1955. The Battle of Leyte Gulf haunted Halsey. In late 1947, Life magazine, then in its heyday, ran an unflattering article, read by millions, entitled Bull's Run. Halsey could not escape second-guessing even in private settings. At a wedding in Honolulu, Halsey ran into his old staff officer, Harris Cox, who was still stewing over the failure to guard San Bernardino Strait. "Admiral, you made a big mistake," said Cox, who may have been emboldened by a cocktail or two. Halsey was so shocked by Cox's blunt accusation that he dropped his cigarette and started a small fire in the couch where he was sitting. Only once, and then somewhat elliptically, did Halsey concede that he should have guarded the strait. In 1953, he confessed to Admiral Mitcher's biographer, Theodore Taylor, "I wish that Spruance had been with Mitcher at Leyte Gulf, and I had been with Mitcher at the Battle of the Philippine Sea." In other words, Halsey acknowledged he had been bold where caution was called for, and Spruance had been cautious where boldness was called for. He kept a running battle going with the greatest of naval historians, Samuel Eliot Morison. During the war, Morison had moved from ship to ship while writing the Navy's official wartime history, and after Leyte Gulf, the historian showed up aboard the New Jersey. Morison was a haughty Harvard Brahmin, and Halsey found him tiresome. "He went to your college," Halsey told John Lawrence. "You take care of him." Morison may have felt snubbed. In any case, Halsey always suspected that Morison harboured a personal animosity toward him. In 1951, Morison irked Halsey by declaring in a lecture that Halsey had blundered at Leyte Gulf. Then, in 1958, Halsey was apoplectic when Morrison's volume on Leyte verged on sidedness. Ham Dow came in to see me last Friday, and we discussed a man named Morrison. Halsey wrote Mick Carney. From his book, Leyte, it is apparent to me that it had got to be answered in some way, or I and my staff are down in history as dubs. I'm not willing to do this without showing my claws. To Rollo Wilson, Halsey wrote, "My idea is to get the man's cajoles in a vice." Carney restrained him. "My dear Admiral Bill," he wrote back, "any attempt to hit back at Morrison, a widely acclaimed historian, was likely to boomerang." After many more such letters back and forth, Halsey finally cooled off. With little to do, in declining health, Halsey was living in New York in a Grand Park Avenue apartment, summering on Fisher's Island, and being chauffeured in a Cadillac with a 5-star Admiral's flag flying from the bumper. But he was no longer living with Fan, who had moved to the West Coast and was increasingly under supervisory medical care. His consolation was nostalgia. He visited the set of The Gallant Hours, originally named Admiral Halsey's Story, depicting Halsey's heroic turnaround of the battle at Guadalcanal in 1942. By now, the star, Jimmy Cagney, looked more like Halsey than the old Admiral, who limped with a cane and wore thick eyeglasses for his cataracts. Halsey's happiest moment came in May 1957, when he joined all of the surviving top U.S. naval commanders from World War II at Annapolis for a celebration called Operation Remember. Halsey straightened when the brigade of midshipmen passed in review on the parade ground where Pudge Halsey had braced almost 6 decades earlier. Halsey's navy had vanished into the mists. It is revealing that after Halsey returned to the United States in 1945, he had denounced the atomic bomb as a cruel and unnecessary tool of war, blaming not only the politicians who decided to use it, but the scientists who made it. Halsey was railing against inhumanity, but also against modernity, against a world in which there would be no place for a sea dog hike Bill Halsey. When the Federation of American Scientists protested Halsey's remarks and demanded a disavowal, Admiral Nimitz had to soothingly step in and say, "I hope that Admiral Halsey's clarifying press statement will inform the public of his real intentions in this matter, and that the scientists will continue to accept him as the heroic, indomitable naval leader he is." After Halsey died, at the age of 76, on August 16, 1959, in his sleep while he was vacationing at Fisher's Island, it was Admiral Nimitz who stood at the head of his casket as he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Nimitz had not forgotten that when the Japanese were riding high after Pearl Harbor, it had been Halsey who damned defeatism and demanded to sail in harm's way. Halsey was buried with full military honors, lying in state in Bethlehem Chapel at the National Cathedral. His flag-draped casket was placed on a caisson drawn by 6 white horses. Halsey's son, William III, had wondered if maybe his father wouldn't have preferred a more modest ceremony. "No," replied Mick Carney, "only a state funeral would do." He was not being grandiose. Halsey had become the nation's admiral, the embodiment of American energy and can-doism, a bit reckless and crude, to be sure, but dominating and lion-hearted. In the impoverished anti-militarist world of post-war Japan, there was not much work for former admirals of the defunct Imperial Japanese Navy. One former flag officer eked out a living as a laborer on a railroad. Some turned to religion. Yasugi Watanabe, Yamamoto's staff officer for chess, who had mournfully walked behind the commander-in-chief's caisson, became a Buddhist priest. Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the first wave of planes against Pearl Harbor, became a Christian missionary. Takeo Kurita became a scrivener. With his cultivated, perfect brushstrokes, he was able to get work copying documents in Japanese. His strong, supple hands were also put to use as a masseur for paying clients. He grew vegetables. He scrounged for wood. He never complained, recalled his daughter Shigeko Terada. As a naval officer on home leave, he had worn kimonos. Now the family kimonos were sold for a few yen, and Kurita wore working clothes. He did not miss the sea, his daughter said. He watched baseball and sumo wrestling on TV and practiced archery in the garden and still, from time to time, engaged in ancient sword fighting with kendo sticks. He played mahjong with his grandchildren and indulged them when they jumped on the sofa. He taught us games. He was very gentle and very precise, said his granddaughter Kazuko Naoe. He had no interest in politics and never talked about the war. He had a rule, said Shigeko. He told her he wished to leave no war records and no diary. Kurita liked to drink, hot water in his whiskey before dinner, and more whiskey after dinner. He liked small hors d'oeuvres, bamboo shoots, and soy sauce. He had a sweet tooth which his family tried to indulge when there was enough money. But mostly he liked to sip whiskey and sake. He preferred a brand of sake called Etajima, after the island home of the Naval Academy. He always sat stiff, straight-backed when he imbibed. Over time, books and articles began appearing speculating on his actions at Leyte Gulf, the mysterious retreat, as some called it. Father never mentioned them, recalled Shigeko, but we knew he suffered. Once she heard him mutter, "I want to go somewhere else." For years, as he silently drank his scotch or sake, Kurita tried to work through in his mind what he had done and not done during those sleepless nights and days on the bridge of the Yamato. From time to time, he broke his silence. His remarks, which evolved over time, suggest that he slowly, painfully, came to acknowledge and accept his true motivations. In 1954, Kurita granted a brief interview to the journalist Masanori Ito, later the author of a widely read book, The End of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His attitude seems to have been, "A defeated general should not talk about his battles," wrote Ito. Kurita was taciturn but apologetic. He told Ito that he had made a mistake by turning around and not continuing with his attack on Leyte Gulf. "At that time I believed it was the best thing to do," Kurita told Ito. "In thinking about it since that time, I have concluded that my decision may have been wrong. I had been given orders, and, as a military man, I should have carried them out." He blamed the stress of staying awake for 3 days under frequent attack. "My mind was extremely fatigued," he said. "It probably should be called a judgment of exhaustion." 299. The telegram locating Halsey's task force was unconfirmed, as Kurita gingerly put it, and in any case his carriers were 100 miles away. No matter how much we pursued, we could not engage his force. It was a mistake on my part to think that we could. The destruction of enemy aircraft carriers was a kind of obsession to me, and I fell victim to it. The journalist Ito ventured that thousands of lives had been spared because Kurita had not entered Leyte Gulf. From that perspective, wasn't his decision fortunate? The admiral, Ito wrote, replied simply, "Yes, I suppose that could be a point." Ito asked Kurita's opinion of the decision by the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Toyoda, to stay at headquarters in Tokyo and not come down to join in the last-ditch fight. To these questions, Ito wrote, Admiral Kurita remained silent and merely smiled a wry smile. Kurita did volunteer one remark. "I was, so to speak, the pitcher of the losing team." To Ito, he said, "You appear to be fond of statistics. Well, my fleet holds the world's record for number of air attacks sustained. Yamato alone was the target of 19 such attacks during the Leyte operation." Kurita soon regretted the interview and retreated back into silence. Twice a year he would make a pilgrimage to Yasukuni Shrine to pay homage to his dead comrades. In 1966, when Admiral Ozawa lay dying, Kurita went to his bedside and held his hand. Ozawa gripped Kurita's hand and wouldn't let go. Ozawa said nothing, Kurita later recalled, but tears streamed down his face. Kurita befriended a younger former naval officer, Jiro Uka, who had been in the last graduating class at Etajima in 1945. Uka, along with 2 other classmates from Etajima, visited Kurita every 2 months. He used to open a new bottle of Johnny Walker Black and enjoyed drinking it straight, recalled Uka. He looked so severe in his photo, but he broke into a smile when he was with us. One autumn day in 1970, Kurita said all of a sudden, "Okay, you should write my biography. I do not trust magazine reporters and writers, but I will tell you everything." Kurita began to retract the story he had told journalist Ito 16 years before. It was not true, he said, that he had misjudged at Leyte Gulf because of fatigue. "Ah, that," he said, when Uka raised the subject. "Ito made me say it in that way." Kurita smiled a bitter smile. Uka recorded, "In a war," said Kurita, "you don't get tired. If you make a mistake in decision-making because you did not sleep 3 or 4 days, then you are not qualified to be the commander of a fleet. I did not make mistakes." Kurita was all injured warrior pride with his former student. He insisted that his decisions during the battle were his alone. He related the story of the mysterious wireless telegram. A telegram arrived, Kurita told Uka. There was a task force in the north. We could catch them if we were within 30 nautical miles northeast. I thought it was only natural to go fight against the stronger forces. The ones in the south were small fries. Uka interjected that there have been theories that the telegram did not exist, or was a telegram sent by the USS side. Kurita bridled. The telegram, he said, was from Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the commander of the Southwest Area Fleet in Manila, who had been his classmate at Etajima. Mikawa was giving him the chance to die honorably, said Kurita. Kurita was entering his 9th decade. It was time for him to face up to reality, that the telegram was a fiction. He couldn't bring himself to admit the truth to his former students, but at least once he opened up in a more honest way. Sometime before he died, in 1977, at age 87, Kurita spent an afternoon with Seiichiro Tokoi, who hailed from Kurita's hometown of Mito and had attended the same middle school. Tokoi had been an Etajima graduate and for many years a city assemblyman. In 2004, Tokoi recalled a visit with Kurita. I wanted to know what happened at Later Gulf because he never really talked about it. He liked sake, so I visited him bringing 2 bottles with me each time. The first 2 times, Kurita-san kept silent and did not answer my question. He was a quiet man and of very strict manners. He would drink a lot, but in the same position with his back always straight. On the 3rd visit, Tokoi brought some Etajima sake. He said to Kurita that General MacArthur had already landed when Kurita was descending on Later Gulf, so what good would it have done to sink some empty transport ships? And if Admiral Halsey's carriers had turned around and caught your fleet, that could have been a real disaster, added Tokoi. That was the reality, said Tokoi. Wasn't it? Kurita replied, Tokoi-kun, using the informal diminutive kun, T could not bear losing 80,000 lives by having the joint fleet completely destroyed. Finally, it seems, the real story had come out. Kurita exaggerated the potential loss of life. 20,000 to 30,000 fatalities are probably closer to the death toll if all his remaining ships had been sunk. But the point was the same. In the end, Kurita had not been willing to sacrifice his men in a futile gesture of nobility. The motto of Kurita's fleet, Masanori Ito wrote, was fight bravely, but die not in vain. That is a good credo for any navy, and Kurita had been faithful to it. Kurita's comrades could never admit the actual reason for the mysterious retreat, even after Kurita died. At his memorial service at the shrine to Admiral Togo in Tokyo on March 11, 1978, officer after officer rose and praised Kurita as a seaman of seamen. But none honored him for his humaneness, as a commander who chose not to foolishly waste the lives of his men in a grand but empty act of Bushido. In the final volume of his History of the Second World War, Winston Churchill tried to make sense of Kurita's decision to turn around at Later Gulf. It may well be that mind had become confused by the pressure of events, wrote Churchill, who was never one to turn away from a fight. But then, with the knowings of someone who had faced enemy fire and known defeat, Churchill added, "Those who have endured a similar ordeal may judge him." Churchill's question can be fairly asked about Evans, Ugaki, and Halsey as well. Who can know what it is really like to stand, bone-weary, on the bridge of a ship in action, responsible for hundreds, if not thousands of lives, unsure of the enemy's strength and whereabouts, yet forced to make fatal decisions? In any culture, there are warriors who meet timeless and universal standards of courage and resolve, who do not seem to need to think or ponder or question, who know instinctively when to lay their lives, and those of their men, on the line. That is not to say their judgment is always correct, just that their bravery cannot be denied. Ernest Evans did not hesitate. His posthumous Medal of Honor citation begins, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Johnston, in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during the Battle off Samar, on October 25, 1944. The citation goes on to describe how Evans was the first to lay smoke, to attack the heavier Japanese ships, to fire his torpedoes. It uses words like undaunted and unhesitating, 766 gallant and indomitable courage and brilliant professional skill. The medal citation concludes, His valiant fighting spirit throughout this historic battle will endure as an inspiration to all who served with him. That was true. 60 years later, most of the 25 or so survivors of the Johnston spoke reverently of their captain as a brave and great hero, and yet a few asked, with some discomfort and usually not for the record, did he really have to turn back again and again to attack the Japanese fleet? Wasn't there some way he could have escaped with honor to live to fight again another day? In the battle off Samar, one of the 3 destroyers and 3 of the 4 destroyer escorts survived the action. Some of the fellows, recalled Ed Takunen, a member of the hard-fighting crew of Gun 55, thought that Evans went beyond the call of duty. Evans pushed way too much, said Robert Sochor, who was one of the last men to see Evans as the Johnston was sinking. The 2 men passed as the ship was heeling over. Sochor was scrambling to abandon ship, and Evans, bloodied and his uniform in tatters, had left his post on the fantail and seemed to be heading back to the abandoned bridge. According to Sochor, Evans's face was blank. He was just staring with a bewildered look. Possibly Evans was in shock from loss of blood and 3 hours of unrelenting stress. Perhaps he was not sure how to die. Matome Ugaki was too sure. Among aging veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Ugaki was not revered. It might have been perfectly honorable for him to take his own life at the end of the war. But in the opinion of most veterans, Ugaki should not have taken 22 others with him on a futile last kamikaze mission after the Emperor had called on his subjects to lay down their arms. "This is a delicate question," said Admiral Manabu Yoshida, the head of the IJN Alumni Association. "In my personal opinion, he shouldn't have taken the youngsters with him. He defied an order from the Emperor. Ugaki was willful. Yet even Ugaki's decision was born of deep shame, disillusionment, and possibly, by the end, a touch of madness. Ugaki was a kind of apotheosis of the sickened, suicidal militarism that ruined Japan. It is hard to exaggerate how deeply the psychosis penetrated Japanese society. In October 1943, 130,000 university students were inducted into the military en masse at a rally at the Meiji Stadium in Tokyo. As they stood in the drizzle, shouldering rifles for the first time, each school group chanted, "Naturally, we don't expect to return alive." Takeo Kurita is harder to judge. Defying an order and possibly embracing a bogus excuse to justify his actions are grave acts in any military. Kurita could not admit until the end of his life, and then only privately and to an old hometown crony, that he had acted to save lives. But given Japanese wartime culture, Kurita's decision to turn around, to sail away from Leyte Gulf, was brave. The expected step would have been to die, pointlessly, but gloriously. In truth, Kurita represented a better Japan, before the insane militarists tried to turn a nation of 70 million people into a shattered gem. Bill Halsey was in a more benign way a product, or at least a tool, of cultural hysteria. Rattled by the Japanese surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, Americans needed to have a damn the torpedoes hero in the early years of the war. Bull Halsey perfectly fit the part. But he became his own caricature, and his superiors didn't seem to know how gracefully to remove him from high command. The irony is that Halsey was not really a plastic man, a prop, but an intensely human figure who cared deeply about his men and suffered with them. He was, like Kurita, required to maintain a pretense that really did not describe him. Human nature can transcend national culture. On battlefields, men of all countries and races usually fight for their buddies more than they do for a flag or some abstract notion of country. And when they die, battlefield witnesses say, they cry out for their mother's character, the courage, decency, and compassion that men sometimes show in the midst of horrific battles can inspire and redeem. But it is a mistake, and a particularly Western one, to romanticize individual will in the face of crushing cultural imperatives. There has never been, and may never again be, a war at sea on the scale of the one that climaxed at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. It should be remembered for its individual acts of heroism and defiance, but more so for the blunders and misunderstandings that are inherent in war.